Phobos and Deimos is a high school drama set in a dystopian future. Maida is a refugee from Mars, where a previously safe and stable society has recently fallen to civil war. She and her aunt make their way to Earth, which is run by an algorithm that has decided that a strict class system that keeps people at odds with each other is what's best for the long-term welfare of humanity. Maida goes to high school, makes friends, loses friends, and finds a group of revolutionaries with some big ideas about freedom and democracy. It's a science fiction story that focuses on the small scale as a reflection of the large scale. It's on Kickstarter right now, and you can pre-order a copy by looking up Phobos and Deimos. Maida's story first started coming together way back in 2005. At the time, I was living in East London, working as a teacher, having moved there from Canada. I wanted to write a story about a brother and sister who moved from Mars to Earth. They were going to be somewhat reminiscent of some of the kids that I taught in East London, and also connected to my own experience having moved from Canada and previously having lived in Taiwan. They were going to be refugees from another planet who felt like aliens and had to deal with a school system that had plenty of problems. I liked the idea so much that I went ahead and did a short 7-page comic about Maida, thinking about what had happened to her brother on Mars and how they were separated. The comic ended up being my first ever mini-comic. I'd done comics before, of course, but this was the first one that I actually printed out multiple copies of and started taking it to conventions. I already had other bigger projects to work on though, so beyond this one 7-page mini-comic, I kind of put the idea up on the shelf for later, and didn't come back to it for many years. Incidentally, this mini-comic was also the first time I started experimenting with using markers to color comics. I'd done color before using digital or watercolor and never been too happy with the results, and I knew I wanted this comic to be in color. And markers, I had some markers, so markers seemed like the thing to try. The technique I developed using markers and pencil crayons ended up being the technique I used for all of Lords in Death and Life, which was my first self-published graphic novel. But it was originally developed for Phobos and Deimos. Not that it was called Phobos and Deimos at the time. Anyways, I moved back to Canada, and over the next few years I finished 2 other graphic novels. Lords of Death and Life, which is sort of a historical fantasy story set in Mesoamerica, and A Mad Tea Party, which is a science fiction story about genetically engineered super soldiers and the next generation that is approaching life very differently. Some of those ideas have evolved and become a part of Phobos and Deimos. In 2014, A Mad Tea Party was winding down, coming to completion, and I needed a new project. It was time to bring out Maida and her brother once again. I'd learned a lot from writing 2 graphic novels already, and this time I wanted to quote-unquote do it right. I was going to write the whole script, start to finish, and have everything figured out before I drew the first page. For the most part that worked, although I didn't actually finish all the editing by the time I started drawing. I did take all the time it needed to write an entire script. I filled notebooks with notes and lists and quotes that I thought would be relevant that I might use in the book, none of which I've actually used so far, by the way. And when making notes of plots in books wasn't enough, then I moved on to thumbnailing. The thumbnailing was basically writing up the whole story beat by beat, with each frame of the comic done in short stick figure form with the dialogue written underneath. I found that worked much better than any of my previous methods for writing. Getting all the plot points to fit together and be revealed to the reader in an order that makes sense took a lot of work, but the hardest part was coming up with the characters. Fortunately, the characters are also my favorite part of this story. The cast was expanded to not just include Maida and her brother, but her aunt and her mom and many friends and enemies that Maida meets along the way. Anyone who's read the webcomic for Phobos and Deimos might have noticed that we haven't actually seen Maida's brother at all, except for a few flashbacks. Well, that's because a big part of the plot is about Maida being separated from her brother. But from the beginning, her brother has been an integral part of the story. The story had evolved a lot since 2005 as well. I still wanted to write a story about migration and class and a school system that had issues. The English school system, at least as it was in 2005 when I was there, seemed almost purposefully designed to perpetuate the class system. Boroughs in London with a large tax base had schools that were well-funded, well-staffed, with plenty of resources, lots of computers, and fancy buildings. Schools in poorer boroughs, like the one that I ended up working in, had no resources, overworked staff, no library, no gym equipment, no field trips. It was quite a stark difference. Meanwhile, the poor schools without money would get extra attention from the government about their test scores, and their funding could be cut even further if they didn't measure up. Maybe this was all more obvious to me because I was coming in as an outsider, but I felt like this story of a deeply unequal school system was grounds for writing something in science fiction. Over the course of Phobos and Deimos, we have the chance to see a few different schools that Maida moves through in her story, and we get to see how they're different from each other, and how that plays into the larger story of this artificially created world. I also spent a lot of time thinking about what sort of society it was that Maida was moving to on Earth. Was it really a dystopia? Did I want to write a story about a world that was universally terrible? That didn't seem like a very fun way to spend my time writing about a future that no one would want to live in. So rather than write a strict dystopia, what I tried to do was I tried to make a world that would make sense. A world that was stable and one where you could lead a good life if you were lucky, but one where the problems were evident and Maida would end up on the wrong side of them. Sina Diaz, the author of the webcomic Dresden Kodak, once posited the idea of a topia, not a utopia or a dystopia, but a fictional future world that was kind of in the middle, where there were good things and bad things. And I find that a much more believable approach to writing stories set in a made-up world. So even though this world was going to be hostile to my main character, and one that she would have to fight against, it wasn't meant to be a world that would just make you depressed about the lack of possibilities for the future. Some of the problems we have in the present have been solved 300 years from now. Others have not been, and then we have a story to tell. Phobos and Deimos isn't set in London, but it is inspired by London, which is why I gave most of the main characters an East London accent. This is certainly true outside of Britain, even more so than it's true in Britain, but the East London accent gets a really bad reputation. A big part of that is classism, with a healthy dose of racism if you're aware of who most of the people that live in the East End are these days. Anyways, the accent is great, and I didn't want to make fun of it. I decided this would be the accent that the majority of people would have in the future. Maida, of course, isn't from Earth, so her accent is quite different. There's no way to tell in the comic because comics don't have sound, but I always imagine her in my head having a perfect Oxford accent because that was the English that she learned in school. The story is set in a domed city in Antarctica. I've often heard it said that it doesn't make sense for humans to start colonizing other planets when there are so many parts of the Earth that we don't live in. For example, Antarctica. It would be much easier to build a settlement in Antarctica than it would be on Mars. And if my main character is from Mars, then it would make sense for there to have already been cities built here on Earth in a continent that's slightly more habitable than another planet. This is a world where racism is over and discrimination based on religion is done, but somehow they haven't given up on classism. There's still rich and poor and a wide gulf in between. It's easy for me to believe that in 500 years' time, we'll have finally finished with racism. But the kind of cultural chauvinism that gets tied up in that is something that might be a little harder to escape. So we have a world where if you come from another planet, where people dress differently and talk differently and act differently, you might still have kids who bully you in school. This world is clearly not a utopia. So after working on it for a long time, I finally had the script for hundreds of pages worth of comics. But once you've spent enough time with a story, it kind of gets inside your head and you don't really have a good sense of whether it's working or not. The next logical step was to share it with someone and see what they thought. So that's what I did. I found someone I trusted to look over my script and give me their honest opinion. Their opinion was that this story wasn't everything it could be. And I think they were right in retrospect. I definitely needed to go back and do a bunch of rewriting, which is what I did. I've lost track of how many drafts of the script I've done over time. Some of the drafts haven't been for the whole story, some of them have just been for parts of the story. But the ending at least has changed significantly at least 3 times. At a certain point, I decided this story was far enough along that I could start drawing it. And then I finally got to start doing the part of comics that I love best, which is drawing characters, putting it down on paper, and then coloring it. As I worked, I continued to keep editing the script, make changes, sometimes small ones, sometimes big ones, and fine-tune the story as I went. In 2016, though, there was a problem. Like a lot of people, a certain presidential election came to me as a complete surprise. Here I was claiming that I could write stories about the future when I couldn't even predict a simple thing like an election outcome. And not just any election outcome. It was immediately apparent that we were, all of us, whether you lived in the United States or not, preparing to spend a whole bunch of time living in a dystopia. Exactly the kind of society I didn't want to write about. The problematic characters in Phobos and Deimos are much more inspired by neoliberal type leaders such as Tony Blair, people who say the right things and occasionally can be bothered to do something worthwhile, but their main agenda is to maintain the status quo for everybody, for better or worse, rather than tear it all down. These are people who are just fine with launching wars in other countries and causing untold harm to anyone that they don't consider part of their group or anyone not worthy of their attention, and not the kind of cartoon villain that we ended up with in charge of the world in 2016. As dangerous as someone like that is, they're just a villain. They're not an interesting villain. They're not someone I want to read a story about, and certainly not a story set in the distant future. There were several months there where I couldn't write a single line of dialogue. The whole project was on hold. Eventually I came to realize, though, that the Tony Blairs of the world were still around, and there was still plenty I could write about them. We now have people like the tech bros in Silicon Valley, or the billionaires who call themselves effective altruists. People who, much like the shadowy villains in Phobos and Deimos, are inspired by old science fiction stories, but not in the way those authors intended. People who think they have what it takes to run the world and can just decide for everybody else. People whose stated goal is to save humanity, but every action they take hurts somebody somewhere. Those were the villains that I had invented Maida to take on. I kept writing Phobos and Deimos, And at this point I was drawing pages as well, but there was one final step that I needed to go through before I could really be happy with the story. I waited until very late in the process to do this, but I wanted to hire some editors who could look at my story and give me advice on specific aspects of culture, language, and religion to make sure that I wasn't writing too far outside my lane. I delivered parts or all of my script to a few different people who could read it over and give me feedback, and it was a really valuable step in the process. There were quite a few changes I made to the story as a result of those conversations. As it stands now, I have the entire script finished for 2 volumes of Phobos and Deimos, all the way to the end. It's taken a lot of years to draw the first half, but I'm at a point where there are enough pages that they can be put together as one volume of a 2-volume graphic novel set. The first book is almost 300 pages. That's plenty. No one wants to try and read a book that's 600 pages. 300 pages is enough. In the first volume of the story, we get to see Maida soon after she's arrived on Earth, her first experiences in high school, the problems she has making friends. Some of those friendships are much longer lasting than others. We'll see her figure out her identity and find a way to position herself in this hostile world by making friends with other people who can fight back against this planet run by an algorithm. I didn't want to shortchange any of the character development that goes on with either Maida or with any of the other people she meets. The themes of the story are all tied up in the world building, but the reason that we care about it is because of the characters. When things go sideways in Volume 2, which they will, I want you to already know as much as possible about all these characters so that everything that they do makes sense. It was over 8 years ago that I started making Phobos and Deimos my #1 priority in making comics. It's been a long process, and even though we're technically only halfway through, since there was a whole other volume yet to draw, I'm really happy with where we're at, and I hope you'll enjoy the story so far. The page that I've been drawing during this video is the title page for the last chapter of the book. I sketched it all out in pencil, inked it with markers and India ink, made a photocopy of the inks, and then used Copic markers and Prismacolors to add color to the photocopy. The last step will be to scan it in, clean it up, and add the text for the title page. You can read all of Phobos and Deimos so far on my webcomic at www.phobos-comic.com. Phobos is spelled Phobos, and I hope you'll check out the Kickstarter and get a copy of the book for yourself. You can find that by looking up Phobos and Deimos on Kickstarter, or going to the publisher's website at Cloudscape Comics, which is www.cloudscapecomics.com. I'm Jay Dalton, and I hope you check out my work. Thanks for listening.